You're listening to the Diginauts on the Good Talk Podcast Network.
Hello, hello. Will my future robot body be strong enough to out-wrestle my future robot army? Can I stump Eric about the latest studies in frog biology? Plus, how blockchain might change how you apply for your next job. All this and more coming up on the Diginauts.
Society, the future, morality, disruption, policy, humanity, innovation, technology.
Why can't we make it exactly as strong as a human? Like, why can't I have decent odds of wrestling my insurgent robot to the ground?
Diginauts.
Greetings, mortals! You have found another episode of the Diginauts. My name is Deron.
And I'm Eric.
And we are here to talk with you about science and technology. We're going to dive right in, this time with something that's been in the news quite a bit. Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, Ethereum. What other buzzwords can I spit out and make it sound like I know what I'm talking about when it comes to tech finance?
That's pretty much it.
Good, because that was the end of my list. So, we're going to talk about the tokenization of everything. Eric, you're our expert.
I am. The thing about it, everyone's been talking about all the speculation around cryptocurrencies and people making money, people losing money, companies using, an ICO or initial coin offering, kind of like an IPO to raise money. But, right, that really avoids why the blockchain cryptocurrencies really matter. Now, if you think about it, they basically enable a ledger, kind of like a bank ledger, where you know who got what or who gave something to someone else, right? And the implications of that are massive. So think about if you wanted to give someone a fraction of your car, right? So let's say you buy a car, but you want to share that car with people and you want them to share in the usage of it. You want them to share in the payment and ownership of it. So effectively, you could, or a company could, create a platform based on the blockchain and say, okay, you want to give Deron 20% of your car, give him X tokens to his wallet, and that indicates that you indeed gave him, 20% of your car as a result of that transaction.
Okay, so quite a concept. Let's back up a step or two and make sure that the fundamentals just make sense to everybody, right? So without talking so much about all of Bitcoin and how it works, there's plenty of helper videos on the internet if you're interested in that kind of thing. The fundamentals to understand is that the blockchain is the underlying driving mechanism that allows people to record their transactions and remove, in theory, any human being from the interaction of the transaction of that record, right? Like, so it's theoretically possible for corruption to exist within a bank. It's theoretically not possible for a super encrypted blockchain to be interfered with by humans, because there are computers on the back end that are solving puzzles in order to win the right to be the person who records that little piece of that transaction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what you're talking about is saying, I'm sorry?
Yes.
I got it. Ha ha, ha ha.
Don't be sorry.
So from there, what you're talking about then is like, okay, but we can take that a step further and tokenize everything. How is that tokenization different than purchasing something with Bitcoin itself?
That's an interesting question.
Ha. So I get your point that the blockchain could theoretically, be the sort of source of that transaction, and that's fine. And some of the conversation that's happening this week, or last week, the Jamie Dimon statement about how Bitcoin's basically a fraud, right? And it actually caused, between that and China saying that, hey, we're going to shut down all the Bitcoin sources, it actually caused the Bitcoin value to tank pretty significantly, right? In the last week or so.
A couple. It dropped below 4,000. Not a crisis, and to me, I view it as a buying opportunity.
Absolutely.
Furthermore, there was a whole tweet storm going around where people allegedly uncovered that while he made those statements,
he bought some.
They have a stake in Bitcoin-related businesses allegedly. So, who knows what his motive was?
You think he was playing the currency?
Quite possibly.
Not that I'm asking you to slander a billionaire on in a public forum, but that was part of my reaction. Is like, influential money dude, you just said some shit and got the internet, got the markets to play with you. That was exactly my thought. Was like that could have been anyway. Getting off track. One of the points he made when pressed on that is like, well, you kind of have to separate the underlying blockchain from the currency itself, which makes a certain amount of sense. There's tons of cryptocurrencies that sit on top of that sit on top of the underlying blockchain. But again, my point is like, what's the difference between saying, okay, we can tokenize everything, and I get your point, right? The initial corporate offerings where you're essentially coming in and purchasing a piece of a company through an underlying blockchain, et cetera, et cetera. How is that different than Bitcoin? And does it take us to a point where none of the currencies are actually needed?
So a couple things. One, the ICOs, you're not necessarily buying a piece of the company. You're getting like the initial, you're the like early buyer of coins. But depending on the company and the purpose, right? Sometimes you are, sometimes you aren't. But I think the value in not using Bitcoin, right? Like Bitcoin's price is it's so high and so volatile that I honestly wouldn't want to pay someone in Bitcoin because the likelihood of it going up in value has exceeded, in my opinion, its likelihood to go down by a significant amount. So ultimately, I think I would be losing money if I paid you in Bitcoin. Whereas if you're using the blockchain to merely assign and record and have a distributed ledger of fractional ownership, that's way different.
Okay. But are we talking about transactions though? I mean, your example was, I'm going to give Deron 20% of my car. Mm-hmm. When do we do this? Why do we need to give me 20% of a car?
Why?
Yeah.
If we wanted to share it.
Cool, but how is that? I'm trying to get to the sort of what's the point? What's the advantage? What's the? I mean, all sorts of technological breakthroughs. There's sort of a reason we do them, right? And
the ease of which I could do it.
Okay.
I don't need a contract, right? Like I basically gave you, whatever, 2 of my car coins.
Okay. So that's something fundamental, right? That like percentage of ownership can be handled without a contract simply because you've defined the value of something in overall percentage of tokens, and then you define the ownership, and then there's no reason to write anything down. Meh. And there's no...
ultimately, it's written as it happens.
Right. So there's no disputing that contract. It's a simple matter of you own this, you own that.
Yep.
Okay. I see it. Any other examples of tokenization that are the trends of the future that you see?
I mean, if you think about in this day and age, it's incredibly easy to impersonate anything, anyone, at any point in time, right? So I think, imagine, like, I could go print a diploma and make it look as real as, an actual one.
Right.
Doesn't mean I went to that institution, but I could print one up and probably convince someone that I did when I didn't. But imagine if, the blockchain served as this certification, right? So all these institutions, whether it be government, colleges, any type of school, anything that requires verification, right? That you did something, you accomplished something, right? Imagine if they used the blockchain, right? So then it's like, so
interesting.
Here's Deron's wallet, right? His certification wallet, and wow, we can see the public ledger that Harvard sent Deron the biology degree, right?
Right. Okay. Yeah, so I mean, for example, for work right now, I'm going through the process of proving that I worked certain places, proving, and it comes down to, do you have a W-2 or whatever? And they're asking me to fax in this proof or that proof, which at the end of the day, as you say, theoretically easy enough to fake on word processing, and then the fact that they want me to fax it to them, of all things, because this is 2017, certainly, that adds to the degree of fidelity to it. So that makes a certain amount of sense that, right, like there's ID protection built into it. You can have a token for a degree, and the person either does or doesn't own that token,
right,
and ownership. So I know that you kind of see currency and money as a ridiculous concept to begin with. Like, are we talking about money going away?
I think without a doubt, physical money will disappear.
I can hear the protests of gold standard purists right now. All right,
you go.
We'll leave it there.
You're listening to the Diginauts on the Good Talk Podcast Network.
All right, segment 2. It's time for a new segment. This is something that we're calling 3 Headlines and a Lie. You may have played a game similar to this as like an icebreaker at different parties where you sell a certain number of truths and a lie and people have to guess. The way this is going to work is one of us, each time we do this segment, will bring 3 actual headlines and 1 completely made up headline, and the other person has to try to guess. You can guess along with us what these are. Now, in full disclosure, this is way harder to do than it seems like, right? Because we're both guys who follow science stories all the time. We co-host a science and technology and society podcast, so we're constantly watching these stories. So it takes a certain amount of digging. I have tried this a couple of times in trials that we've done in the background, and we've actually done test recordings, and Eric has beaten me both times so far. He has
Prepare for another.
Say again?
Prepare for another.
He's looking to go 3 for 3. None of those other ones count. None of those are official. Those have asterisks next to them. Those were just trials. We were just warming up, testing out a new segment. But this, today, is the first official attempt to actually beat Eric with... I think he won't have heard of these headlines. I went intentionally well out of his areas of interest. So we'll see if he can discover which of these 4 stories recently reported, we're going to aim for like the last month or so, is in fact a complete fabrication, and which 3 are real. Now, this time, I have prepared a theme for our stories. All 4 stories have to do with frogs. Is that your cup of tea? Did I nail it?
Nailed it.
Excellent. We'll see how you do. Story number 1. A researcher thinks male African cane frogs change color so that they will stand out during froggy orgies. What I love about this is if I made that up, it's genius. If I didn't make it up, it's even more genius. No. True story. Definitely a true story. These are all definitely true. what this has to do with is the mating strategies of certain frogs. A strategy for survival in the evolutionary sense is, something that a species does in order to make sure that for every existing specimen now, there are at least a replacement in the next generation. For these frogs, the advantage to them is to basically just get in a pile and go at it when it comes mating season. And these researchers were super interested in how this would work, and they discovered basically that some of the male frogs turned yellow for mating season. They were interested in why this happened, and they don't know, but they went back, checked records on all the research they'd done on these frogs. The prevailing theory is that it's just such a mass of little froggy bodies that there is a biological evolutionary advantage to the males standing out so that the females can find their way to the males, and that's why they're yellow. That's story number 1, believe it or not. Yes. All right. Story number 2. Scientists have discovered a frog capable of hibernating for a decade without food or water. This was in the Australian outback. A professor from the University of Canberra has discovered a frog. They had what they haven't done yet is proven, like they haven't, gotten the frog into a pen and sat there and, watched for 10 years as it did its thing. But they're pretty sure that from what they're observing, the frog should be able to survive approximately a decade. Australia is weird the way the water flows. They can be a desert for like a number of years and then suddenly get what amounts to a monsoon. And so there's all sorts of animals that have these different adaptations. This particular frog, they're not entirely sure the years, but they tested it in suspended animation. It works out to basically its heart beats like once a week to keep it alive. It's not a beat; it's just there is still flow, but everything is shut down so super slow that this frog can stay alive for a super super long time, essentially in biological suspended animation until the rains come back, and then there you go. So that's story number 2.
Right.
Story number 3. Scientists have figured out that a frog existed in Madagascar long ago, capable of eating dinosaurs. So this was research also out of Australia. They have a fossil record of this frog. They've compared it to modern day frogs, and by figuring out how hard he is able to clamp down, the bite force of the frog, which is super, they compared it to, 500 pounds existing on the tip of your finger. They figured out that it would be physically possible for this frog at the size that it is in the fossil records to eat small dinosaurs, like little baby dinosaurs would have been on the menu for this frog. It's been extinct for about 60 million years, but they've reached the conclusion that dinosaurs must have been in this frog's diet to sustain its unusual size. And
how big was it?
How big was the frog?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Bigger than a small dinosaur, I'm going to say. I think they're in the world of like a terrier. Bite force, blah blah blah. Yeah, I don't have the how big was it stat. So you're gonna have to decide whether I just don't have that or whether I'm pulling it out of my ass. Okay, 4th story. Here we go. Scientists have finally figured out why poison dart frogs don't poison themselves. The reason that this is something that they're even thinking about is because the way the frogs get their poison is essentially by eating centipedes. The centipede poison builds up, gets repurposed, comes out of their skin through special glands. And the problem is, the way the poison works is it shuts down the sodium channels that are the way your nerves work. Sodium and potassium switch places in nerves. So essentially it just like shuts you down. That poison, like the little tiny frog the size of a quarter, can kill 10 men with the poison on it. And the question was, well, if these frogs are capable of poisoning things and their nervous system works the same way as human nervous systems, then why don't they poison themselves? And they finally were able to get in at the DNA level. They found that there's one little switch of a gene that makes the protein that causes the sodium channels to do their thing not as sensitive to this toxin. So, I mean, long story short, immunity. That's how they don't get poisoned themselves. But they just recently in the last month figured out exactly how that immunity comes along. So, drum roll moment. There are 4 stories. It is your job for the first official 3 headlines and a lie to figure out which of these stories is not true. 1, researchers think that frogs are turning yellow during mating season so that that the females can find the males. Frogs are capable of withstanding perhaps up to a decade of suspended animation in the Australian outback. A frog exists in the fossil record that ate small dinosaurs. And scientists have finally figured out why poison dart frogs don't poison themselves. So, can you make it 3 for 3, really just 1 for 1, officially?
I can.
Which story do you think is true? Or is false?
The frog-eating dinosaur story is a bunch of bullfrog.
So you think out of those 4 stories, the one that I made up was the fact that there used to be a frog that ate small dinosaurs?
Yep.
ScienceDaily.com reports on September 20th that out of the University of Adelaide, scientists say that a large now-extinct frog called Beelzebufo lived about 68 million years in Madagascar, capable of eating small dinosaurs. Boom! 0 for 1!
Man.
Gotcha! You want a second guess?
Shit. The first one?
No! Totally true! Popular Science reports that these frogs might change color to avoid... This is their title. This is their headline. These frogs might change color to avoid confusion during orgies.
All right, so then I think it's the poison frog.
Wrong! My victory is complete and total.
Which one was it?
It was the second story, a frog capable of withstanding a decade of hibernation in the Australian outback. Totally made that up. I had a fake professor name standing by just in case. Heartbeats once a week, no. Now, all good lies are based on some truth. There are some frogs that are capable of long hibernation periods. There's a North American frog that essentially freezes for the winter. And it sounds like shuts down entirely. But to my knowledge, there is no frog that is able to withstand a decade of hibernation. You have officially been crushed, and there is no record of you ever having beaten this game. So you are 0-1 at the start of the season. This is a new segment that is definitely coming back. I can just feel that. And we'll play with it both ways. I'm sure one of these days Eric will try to beat me. I doubt he will ever be able to crush me as soundly as I have just crushed him with my little liar's game. Oh, how big do the frogs get? Oh, I don't know. The size of a terrier? Okay, next up, coming off that stunning victory, segment 3 is the future file. We have another story, another pretty unbelievable headline. This is about some scientists out of Columbia School of Engineering and Applied Science who have created a 3D printable synthetic soft muscle capable of lifting 1,000 times its own weight.
So why is this such a big deal?
It is a big deal because the applications in robotics are nuts. Like if you want to, they call it soft robotics. So thinking about someday having something Android-like, you need something that functions kind of like human muscle, right? If you can get the battery packs worked out and all that kind of stuff, then for something to be kind of walking around without a wire and go from that sort of image of the tethered robots that we kick over into the sort of like Data from Star Trek, you need something that is able to work this way. And they say that it's the new material also has a strain density or ability to expand 15 times larger than natural muscle. It basically works out to be muscles that are like roughly 3 times stronger than natural muscles.
So can they be used for humans?
I mean, I would think that would be an application as well, right? Anywhere that you can, if you've got a prosthetic or something like that where you would put some sort of mechanical replacement, I would assume that this would be the same thing. Now, I don't know anything about the sort of like power involved, right? How that works. But in terms of the muscle actually doing what it needs to do, they are able to create a self-contained soft actuator is what they're calling it. And, in theory, if we can make it work for robots, we should be able to make it work for humans, at least partially. The same way that any technology we have that could be robotic now, you can put on a human to the extent that you can power it and get it to work autonomously. So this leap forward for autonomous creation of robots should be a leap forward for human prosthetics as well. And or cyborgs. Nice. And my eventual robot body that I hope to download my brain into. I'm pleased to hear that it will be three times stronger than my current body.
Yeah, you could weightlift.
Well, you wouldn't need to weightlift because you could just 3D print some more muscles. like, I mean, yes, you could impress people, but with how much you're able to lift. But like, there wouldn't be a point to that, right? Human muscles. The whole point of weightlifting is that you're tearing them down and forcing them to rebuild stronger. In this case, you just printed it. It's there. It's good to go.
So now you just have to get an embedded 3D printer.
So that you can make more and more muscle? I feel like that I'm willing to, go into the shop for. I don't know. My question is always like, as we slowly make advances in robotics, and I kind of like to look at the world through more of the Japanese model than the Western model of like, if we make robots, they will kill us all. That said, why do we got to make robots that are 3 times stronger than us? Like, that's
don't be scared.
Well, you want a certain degree of like, if shit goes down, if something goes wrong, and as every Western sci-fi has told us is the destiny, the artificial being gains sentience and turns on his creators.
So just 3D print more muscle for yourself.
For yourself. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Which again takes us back to the robot body. Like, if I've downloaded my brain successfully, when he finally turns on me, I can just, But my point is, why we got to make it 3 times stronger? Why can't we make it exactly as strong as a human? Like, why can't I have decent odds of wrestling my insurgent robot to the ground? But no one asked me. That's how these things work. Good job, scientists. You've ensured our demise. No, in all seriousness, this is a pretty cool breakthrough, and they've got a low power way to make this work, and it's definitely a huge step forward for robotics. So, good job, scientists.
Hey, you listening? Yeah, I know you are. You're listening to our podcast, and we appreciate it. But we'd appreciate it more if you go to iTunes, especially the store, go in, log in, leave us a review, preferably 5 stars, and write nice things, and we'll get this podcast where it really needs to be in terms of more listeners. Thanks.
Hey, this lands us at segment 4. That means it's time to dig some more, because I like segment titles that rhyme. First up is Deron's omnibus offering of Mother Earth dispatches, otherwise known as DOOMED, a handy little acronym that just happened to spell out a word to summarize it. This is where we revisit current status of climate change and environmentalism. As always, we'll do the quick headline review. Not so happy. Arctic sea ice once again shows considerable melting.
Shocker.
Right? Yeah, well, when we had the story last week about they actually for the first time sailed a cargo ship through the Arctic sea ice, so we know that's definitely one of the worst seasons, but there's been pictures published of this year's kind of peak, and it's not pretty. Or anti-peak. What's the opposite of peak?
Doldrum.
Most melted? Doldrum? Ice doldrum? Other headlines, Futurism.com has, this could be the West's worst fire season ever. Living as I do in the Pacific Northwest, I can testify to the fact that I can't remember the kind of smoke and unbreathable air that we've had in this area over the last month. As a father of small kids, it's definitely problematic. I've woken up with sore throats and had a hard time breathing, and we're just full on not they've been warning people not to go, don't mow the lawn this week because you can't go out and do that kind of physical activity in this kind of air. Through all the wildfires that have been going on in the Northwest. So that's no fun. Old fish few and far between under fishing pressure. So, the typical, if you scan the headlines, it ain't pretty. But I wanted to take a look at the one featured story I wanted to talk about today is in New Scientist. And it's a theory about CO2 trapping. It's kind of new. You asked when we were talking about this last week, what we can do to help reverse it. And my point was kind of, when you have the different gases in the atmosphere, there's only so much you can do. You essentially have to resort to carbon trapping. You have to take some of that carbon somehow out of the air. And nature has all sorts of mechanisms. For example, a tree is a carbon trap, right? Because it breathes in the CO2 and takes it and makes it into a tree. And then that carbon lives there and not in the air. But we burn down the tree, and then the carbon goes back into the air, and we don't have that carbon trap. Or seashells are a carbon trap, where the animals are creating, I think it's usually calcium carbonate in the shells, and that biomass of those animals that have their shells have calcium and carbon trapped together. Is another way that carbon is not in the air. But then we acidify the oceans and melt the coral, and right? Do you see a trend? So there are natural carbon traps, but a lot of science is out there attempting to come up with ways that we can either find filtrations that will store the carbon, or even just straight up pump carbon out of the atmosphere. And this interesting new theory this week's is that we could store carbon dioxide as liquid lakes under the sea.
Under the sea?
Under the sea. I'm not going to start singing because of Disney copyrights. But
wait a minute. Wait. Like, are you talking within the sea or like under the sand under the sea?
So the science behind it is interesting, and it's purely theoretical. But what happens is if you get CO2 deep enough, below about 300 meters, it must be enough pressure for it to change to liquid. And it's denser than water at those depths, so it will naturally sink to the bottom and stay there. Because when I first heard about the idea, what came to mind for me is like some of those like volcanic lakes where they have to, have the little fountain in them that causes the whole thing to bubble up, because if they don't, the gas will kind of trap at the bottom and then escape in one big bubble of noxious gas that then kills everybody below a certain height. But the theory here is that like once you get below a certain depth, that carbon dioxide isn't coming back up as bubbles. It's going to stay liquid carbon dioxide at the bottom of the sea. The theorist who put this together came up with a specific location. He said that there's an area just south of an Indonesian archipelago big enough to accommodate 19 trillion tons of liquid carbon dioxide, which is greater than all the CO2 from total global fossil fuel emissions. I don't know if they mean, per year, or if they just mean everything we've ever put up into the air. We could stick right down there and have it be okay. There's problems with the idea that if carbon dioxide dissolves in water, that's the whole acidification issue. But the theory is that if you put it down there, have some plastic sheeting over the top, we're good to go. So
Plastic? No.
Yeah, right. Well, listen, we keep nuclear waste in old, metal barrels with some concrete in them. So anyway, it's interesting at least that people are getting a little more serious about like, look, we're going to have to trap this stuff if we're going to truly be able to reverse things. Now, that said, I mentioned that I think we should try to finish up our doomed segment each week with an optimistic finish. And there was actually there's a couple stories. The first one is just downright optimism in the way scientists report global climate change, which you just don't see that very often. But the bottom line is, when it comes to predictions in global climate change, scientists are using the best data that they have in order to try to predict where we end up with, the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, what that will do to temperature, what that will do to ice levels, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole hell of a lot of factors going into that. And your predictions can only be so good, right?
Sure.
We know that the goal of the Paris climate change deal is to try to keep us from going 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial averages. And it was always kind of seen as like, yeah, that's nice. That's not going to happen. Some people even say 2 degrees C isn't going to happen. But Paris is attempting to kind of aim for somewhere in there and say, hey, here's all the stuff we got to do in order to make that happen. Well, this new study came out and said, actually, using these numbers and those estimates, they think that at our current numbers, we could make it maybe another couple decades further than previously expected before we cross 1.5.
All right.
Right? So it's a moment of like, because you see the Paris numbers, and the Paris numbers are kind of like, yeah, even if that goes as well as it could go, we're still kind of in peril, especially if the U.S. doesn't pull its head out of its ass. But this kind of gives us, like, if there's an extra 20-year window in there before we're sort of past the point of no return, then, you know, we've got a chance of electing a different administration, for example. Right. You know, or the sort of slow roll of political will, you know, has a chance. Now, that said, this is just another study and just another another prediction, right? So, who knows? But
yep.
in a world of like each study seeming worse and worse than the one before, one came out that was better. So, well, there's a little bit of optimism for you. And finally, to round out Doomed this week, I couldn't go past another little optimistic story, which is that scientists think that they may be able to remedy cow farts.
What?
I just let that sit there long enough for you to go, what? So you know how we talked last week about methane being a worse greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide by about 80 times. We talked about the meat industry putting a demand on nature for cattle that wouldn't exist without humans. The fact of the matter is that cows sit around and burp and fart carbon dioxide, methane, at significant rates, right? And it all has to do with the fact that their body is attempting to make energy out of grass. Well, some scientists studied the gut bacteria of cows. They're pretty sure that cows could potentially selectively breed cows that have a lower ratio of the specific bacteria that helps create more of the methane, the methanogenic bacteria in the cow's gut biome, and significantly reduce the amount of methane produced into the atmosphere on a yearly basis, even if they don't ask anybody to cut down their meat consumption.
That's impressive.
Right? As a carnivorous environmentalist, struck by my own hypocrisy, I think that's about as good a news as you can hear. So
yeah, that's pretty promising.
We'll see. I mean, there has to be enough reason for people to do it. I don't know if there has to be a little government incentive behind something like that, or whatnot, or if scientists will do that selective breeding out of their own goodwill. But it's not something that will cost them a lot in order to make what could be a pretty good change. So anyway, so that rounds out Doomed today. But in the rest of our dig some more, I'll segue nicely because the other piece that I was going to explore is lab-grown meat, which we talked about just last week. And a big deal is being reported this week, which is that China has inked a deal with Israel to purchase, the overall contract is worth about $300 million for lab-grown meat. It turns out, I guess, Israel is one of the leaders in the technology of lab-grown meat. And
so they're selling it to China?
I mean, this particular piece that I'm reading on futurism.com, it's written weirdly, right? Like, they don't say China bought $300 million worth of meat. They say that they've signed a trade agreement worth $300 million. So I don't know if all of that is actual exchange of, goods and services. Like, is it money for meat, or is there incentives back and forth? Well, for fake meat,
futures
for lab meat. It's not fake meat. It's just all protein, no fat, basically. It is animal cells. So Anyway, so it doesn't get into the details of like what's actually trading hands. It just says that this deal was for $300 million. Now, who knows what other trade incentives or tariffs or other products may be involved in there. But it is being called a lab-grown meat deal. So we were discussing the degree to which, this was potentially a huge economic industry, and that has proven out less than a week later with a $300 million deal taking place.
Not bad.
Yeah, not bad. So, rounding out the Let's Dig Some More section, you've got a couple of pieces for us.
I do. Our friend, not really, Peter Thiel, who still is aligned with the Trump organization, even though many executives have distanced themselves and dropped out of the respective committees they were on. He's stayed with them. But supposedly he is being considered for Trump's Intelligence Advisory Board, which, if you think about what Thiel has invested in the past, Palantir is basically a platform by which you could analyze people's activity, and especially it's been used by governments, been used by police organizations. With him in a role like that, it just becomes almost like a conflict of interest.
Right. Except for the almost part. Like, right, I mean, this is a guy who has a financial interest in spy technology being considered for essentially a top spy position.
Right.
Not to mention that technology is potentially very invasive and, ought to be considered with a whole lot of, it was one of the segments of our jurisprudence segment where, we're talking about, hey, society isn't ready for what this technology is doing. And nonetheless, the guy who theoretically owns it is sort of handing it to a president who some have described as a tiny bit power hungry. As with all things that are happening in the current administration, I can just cross my fingers and say I hope this doesn't happen. But whenever we see a headline that says Trump is considering doing this terrible thing, it tends to happen the following week. So we'll see, but I'm not optimistic. And if all of my information hadn't already been exposed by the Equifax leak, I'd be all the more worried. Good stuff. All right, final story for the week.
In similar news, Trump's FCC is deciding to change the rules around like what they consider fast internet. So they're dropping it from down to like 10 megabits a second. So it just becomes comical, and it just gives more power to all the respective internet providers. It just makes things comical.
Who already get to say up to these speeds, right?
Right.
Like they're not actually selling you those speeds. They're selling you up. You might get those speeds, right? Like. So I mean, it's the definition as exists now is like 25 megabits per second download, and they're going to get to say 10 now is worthy of the label high speed internet and or broadband internet. Make America great again, like by lowering the bar.
Yeah, make it slower again.
Make America have the technology it had 10 years ago again.
Make Korea have even faster internet.
Yeah, the amount that they are already ahead of us, let's just go ahead and give them an extra lead. That's not impressive. I mean, depending on your bandwidth, depending on your resolution, the speed you need to watch a high definition movie is, again, it depends on a few factors, but it's in the neighborhood of that, right? It's like somewhere between 5 and 10, depending on the how much quality you're sending through. So it's basically saying we have this current definition of high-speed internet that is 2 or 3 people in your house could be playing video games and watching movies at the same time, and your internet will still kind of do its web surfing in the background for another user, and none of those people is going to feel it. That's what high-speed means, without that up to thing. And now we're going to change that and say, nah, actually, one of you can watch Netflix, and that's still called high-speed. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you to your team of wonderful people that you've appointed. That's so transparently in the interest of business and not in the interest of consumers. I don't see how. I guess the key is to just have so many other things going on that people don't complain about that because they're busy trying to fight healthcare, let's say. So, not trying to get political. That's just the straight on. Like, there's nothing political about it. It's like, don't make my products suck.
Yeah.
Like, or at least make it significantly cheaper when you do, but that's not part of it. So, all right, not to end on that note, but we're ending on that note. On the plus side, think about all the wonderful things you've heard. Frog orgies, right? Cow farts. Let's re-summon some of those wonderful bright notes for the end. You have listened to another episode of the Diginauts. Thank you very much for coming and checking us out. We would love to hear from you and hear your opinions on cow farts and frog orgies. Check us out on Twitter at Good Talk Network, or I am at Digital Deron.
And I'm at eFader.
And we also can be found on YouTube, on Instagram, on Facebook. You can leave a comment via our voicemail or via the website at goodtalknetwork.com. We would love to hear from you. We would love to play your comments as part of our recordings and share what you have to say as you join these conversations. Once again, thank you very much for discussing the science and technology and society topics of the day. Thanks for joining me, Eric. Good talk.